During the 14th century towards the end of the Middle Ages, that is to say, the late 15th century to the early 16th century, there was a constant struggle between the kings and nobles. The first crisis took place in 1307 when the King Edward II was deposed and cruelly murdered. In 1327, his heir, Edward III, punished the responsibles. In 1377, a new king rose to the throne. This was Richard II. He was extremely unpopular, and it is known that he imprisoned his uncle John of Gaunt. In 1399, a new king rose to the throne. This was Henry IV, also known as Henry of Lancaster. He was John Gaunt's son, and he took the throne by force and deposed Richard. In 1413, his heir, Henry V, came to the throne. He became one of England's favorite kings. He signed the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. In 1422, his baby son, Henry VI, was the new king. John Duke of Bedford takes charge of Henry's duty because he was a baby. As it was mentioned previously, the first crisis started in 1327 when the King Edward II was deposed and cruelly murdered. His son, of 11 years old, punished the responsibles as soon as he could. But the principle that a king couldn't and shouldn't be deposed nor killed was already broken. Towards the end of the 14th century, Richard II was killed as well because he had made himself extremely unpopular due to the bad choice of advisors. These advisors ruined the positions of some nobles who weren't chosen. It is also known that he was rich and proud, that he quarreled with these nobles, and that he abused his power to humble them. The king imprisoned his uncle, known as John of Gaunt, who was an important noble of those times, and let him die in prison. He also exiled his cousin Henry of Lancaster, that is to say, John Gaunt's son. In 1399, John of Gaunt's son, Henry of Lancaster, alias Henry IV, returned to England. He rebelled against Richard and deposed him from the throne. Richard had no children, so there were two new possible options to take the crown. One was Henry, and the other one was the Earl of March. Henry was way stronger, as he had the support of some other powerful nobles. That's how he took the throne by force. It is known that Richard died mysteriously soon after. With the new king, England lived peacefully, but the seeds of a civil war had been already sown. 50 years later, the nobility got divided into the Lancastrians, that is to say, Henry's supporters, and the Yorkists, those supporters of the Earl of March. Wales in revolt. In 1280, Edward I had conquered Wales and colonized it. He had sent his people to Pembrokeshire to enlarge small towns. This is the so-called Little England beyond Wales. Edward's troops drove many Welsh people into the hills, and their lands were given to English farmers. Due to this unfair situation, many Welsh had to join the English army and fight for them against Scotland and France in order not to lose their lands. 50 years later, the Welsh found a man who was brave enough to fight against the king, and his name was Owain Glyndwr, who had a lot of supporters, and it is known that he was a descendant of two royal families that had ruled different parts of Wales before the Normans came. He joined the revolts of Norman Welsh border to free themselves from the English rule. But after 10 years of this rebellion, this became a national war. As a result, he was proclaimed the Prince of Wales. But despite his bravery, he wasn't strong enough to defeat the English forces. And not long later, the Welsh surrendered the idea of freedom. In 1410, Owain decided to escape, but he was never captured. The most important thing he did for the Welsh people was giving back to them the feeling of a national identity. So let's make a review of the timeline of the kings. In 1307 we have Edward II that was supposed and cruelly murdered. In 1327 his son Edward III punished the responsibles. Then the new king rose to the throne. In 1377 he was Richard II, who was extremely unpopular. In 1399 Henry IV took the throne by force and he deposed Richard. In 1413 we have Henry V. He was one of the most favorite kings, and he was also involved in the Treaty of Troyes. In 1422 they had a new king, a baby king, that was Henry VI. As he was a baby, his uncle took charge of his duty. By the end of the 14th century, the so-called the 100 Years' War had already been going for over 50 years, but there were times without actual fighting. When Henry IV died, England was living in peace. That is why his heir, Henry V, felt quite confident to attack again. He was brave enough and so intelligent that people considered him as one of the most favorite kings of England. He had great advantage because the King of France, that was Charles VI, he was mad and his nobles were quarrelsome. This king suffered a mental illness that included hallucinations, delusions, and paranoia, and this created some conflict in his reign. So Henry defeated the French and managed to capture most of Normandy, having the support of the Burgundians. Those were the French enemies of Charles VI, and as a result, the Treaty of Troyes in 1420 established that Henry would be the heir of the French crown, but he had to marry Catherine, that is to say, the Mad King's daughter. This was a strategic marriage to unify the two nations, but before Henry could sit in the throne, he died. His baby inherited the crown. As the new king was still a baby, his uncle, the Duke of Bedford, took charge of the situation. He enlarged the area under English control, but soon the French rebelled. They had a new leader who was known as Joan of Arc. She was considered a heroine who gave them back a French national feeling of identity. It is known that she claimed to hear heavenly voices, and this is the reason why the Burgundians captured her and gave her to the English crown, that ended up burning her as a witch in 1431. When John of Bedford died, the English and Burgundians, who had an ally in the beginning, an alliance, let's say, they started distrusting this alliance, and the Hundred Years' War came to an end when England lost everything and they could only keep the port of Calais.
So for this second part, I will start talking about three kings that appear to give a little of context. First, we have Henry VI, who born on December 8 of 1421. He inherited the throne as an infant, becoming the youngest person to inherit the English throne at just 9 months of age. He was described as shy, timid, and benevolent, and didn't like violence. And after 1453, he became mentally unstable. He was the founder of two places of learning, Eton College in 1440, and then the King's College. His reign was marked by a regency council governing the country until 1437, when he was considered old enough to rule for himself. He was also married to Margaret of Anjou, and he died in May 21 of 1471. Then we have Edward IV, who born in April 28 of 1442. He was described as tall, of good looking, and with a bursting energy. He secretly married Elizabeth Woodville. She was a commoner. They got married in 1464, which was considered an unwise and unusual decision. So historians defer that it was a calculated political move. He was the king of England twice. The first reign was from 1461 until October of 1470, and the second was from April 1471 until his death in 1483. He made great preparations for an invasion in 1474 to France, but he actually invaded France in 1475 with the largest England army that had ever been sent. However, the invasion was largely unsuccessful, and he reached a financial settlement with France through the Treaty of Picquigny, and he died in April 9 of 1483. Then we have Richard III, who born in October 2 of 1452. He was the last Yorkish king of England, and he presented himself as a reformer committed to justice and morality, seeking to remedy the supposed misrule of Edward IV. His reign was marked by significant controversies, including the execution of Lord Hastings, the Lord Chamberlain, and it was also characterized by the hostility of the Yorkish exiles. He was portrayed as a brutal, cold-hearted villain, particularly in Shakespeare's play Richard III, and he died in August 22 of 1485. So, what is the relationship between these three kings? Well, because England had lost the war, and it was being ruled by a mentally ill king, it was natural for the nobles to ask questions about who should be ruling the country. So the nobility were divided between those who remained loyal to Henry VI, the Lancastrians, and those who supported the Duke of York, the Yorkish. The Duke of York was the heir of the Arch of March, who had lost the competition for the throne when Richard II was deposed in 1399. And in 1460, the Duke of York claimed the throne for himself, but after his death, his son Edward took up the struggle, and won the throne in 1461. So Edward the Fourth put Henry into the Tower of London, but 9 years later, a new group of Lancastrians, a Lancastrian army, rescued him and chased Edward out of the country. But he was able to raise another army, so he returned to England in 1471 and defeated the Lancastrians, and he won the throne again, and Henry died in the Tower of London. And the war between the Yorkish and the Lancaster would have probably end there if Edward's son had been old enough to rule, and if Edward's brother Richard Gloucester had not been so ambitious. Because when Edward the Fourth died in 1483, his own two sons, Edward V and his younger brother, were put in the Tower by Richard of Gloucester. So Richard took the crown, and he became King Richard III. A month later, the two princes were murdered. So that's why William Shakespeare in the play Richard III accuses Richard of murder, and almost everyone believed it. So he was really not popular, and neither the Lancasters or the Yorkies like him. So how does the Tudor dynasty appears? The Tudor dynasty born with Henry Tudor, who born also known as Henry VII, who born in June 28 of 1491. He was the son of Howard Tudor, who took service with the King Henry V and Henry VI. So he was a Lancastrian. He married after his victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. He reinforced his position by getting married to Elizabeth of York, and this marriage played a crucial role symbolically because because of this union, we can say that the Lancastrians and the Yorks become one kingdom. The Tudor period saw significant changes in England that were marked by artistic achievements, and not only about art, but also about architecture, trades, exploration, and the evolution of the commerce. Henry Tudor died in January 28 of 1547. So with Henry Tudor, we can say that the war had finally ended, and much later in the 19th century, the novelist Walter Scott named these wars the War of Roses, because the York's symbol was a white rose and the Lancaster a red one. So when the dynasties become one, the new symbol was a red and white rose. The War of Roses nearly destroyed the English idea of kingship forever, and after 1460 there had been little respect for anything except the power to take the crown. So Tudor historians made much of these wars and made it seem as if much of England had been destroyed, which it was not true. However, the wars were a disaster for the nobility, because for the first time there had been no purpose in taking prisoners, because no one was interested in payments of ransom. Everyone was more interested in destroying the opposing nobility. So by the time of the Battle of Bosworth in 1458, the old nobility had nearly destroyed itself, and almost half of the lords of the 60 nobles' families had died in the wars. Meanwhile, all this was happening in Scotland. Scotland was experiencing many of the disasters that affected England at this time. For example, we have the Black Death or other plagues, and they also suffer from repeated wars. Scotland also paid for heavily for the alliance that it has with France, because Scotland supported France during the Hundred Years' War. So the English repeatedly invaded the Scottish lowlands, from which most of the Scot kings' wealth came. Also, the Scottish kings were involved in long struggles with the nobles, and several kings died early in mysterious ways. Some of them in mysterious ways. For example, James I was murdered in 1437. James II died in an accident before he was 30 in 1460. And James III was murdered in 1488. And the early death of so many Scots kings left the government in the hands of the powerful nobles until the dead king's son was old enough to rule. So these nobles took the chance to make their own position more powerful. As in England, the nobles kept private armies instead of using serfs for military service as they have done earlier. They created this new system that fitted well with the Celtic tribal loyalties of the Highlands. Not all the members of the clan were related to each other, because some groups joined a clan for protection, or because they were forced to choose between doing it or leaving the area. And so they had this obligation to join a clan. The most powerful of the Highland clans by the 15th century was the clan Donald, um, and the chiefs of these clans were almost completely independent. By the end of the Middle Ages, Scotland had was developed as a nation in a number of ways. For example, in from 1399, the Scots demanded that a parliament should meet once a year, and kings often gathered together leading citizens to discuss matters of government. The towns also grew in importance, mainly because of the wool trade, which grew thanks to the help of Flemish settlers. And there was a large export trade in wool, leather, and fish, mostly to the Netherlands. Also, the Scotland's alliance with France brought some benefits. At a time when much of the farmland was repeatedly destroyed by English armies, many Scotsmen found work as a soldiers for the French king. So the connection with France helped to develop also education in Scotland. They follow the example of Paris. So the universities were founded in Scotland at St. Andrews in 1412, Glasgow in 1451, and at Aberdeen in 1495. So Scotland could rightly claim to be equal with England in learning. And by the end of the 15th century, it was obvious that Scotland was a separate country from England. So nobody either in England or in Scotland believed in the English king's claim to be overlord of Scotland.